Really excited to be here with you this afternoon because the folks on this panel, such a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I know they're gonna give you tons of things to take away with you after you leave this afternoon. I have the privilege of facilitating this panel, and you know what, we're just gonna dive straight in. So let's start off with an easy question. Let's start off with an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what issue, in your opinion, is impacting Asians and Asian Americans that really matters to you right now. So introductions, and what issue that's impacting Asians and Asian Americans that's really important and matters to you right now.
My name is Aimee Phan. I am a fiction writer. I've written 2 works of fiction. The first is a collection of stories called We Should Never Meet, which deals with there are 8 stories based on surrounding the events of Operation Baby Lift, which was the emergency evacuation of Amerasians and Vietnamese orphans days before the Vietnam War. And my second book is a novel called The Re-Education of Cherry Chung, and it's about a multi-generational Vietnamese family living in both France and America. And so from both of those books, and most of my work has been dealing with stories about people from the Vietnamese diaspora. So my books are often taught in college campuses and even high school campuses, and the issues that often come up when I have these discussions with them is about immigration and refugee experiences and how people migrate around the world and deal with the different social, political, and cultural communities that arise from history and what we can learn from them. And so I feel like that probably is the most important issue that pops up in a lot of my readings and panels and discussion is how do we address the current immigration and the ongoing immigration issues that are happening not only in this country but around the world. How do we help other people in other countries in need? And I think especially the Vietnamese community, we have a lot to say about it. And we, especially since our community was the last major migration of refugees into America, we haven't had another recent one. And I think that the Vietnamese American community can be seen as an example of the incredible benefits and richness that can happen when you are generous and when you're compassionate and when you're exercising empathy, which is, I think, something that's really important to consider when we're thinking about a lot of laws that are being enacted and proposed right now.
Thank you, Aimee.
So my answer, I think, ties into that quite a bit. But my name is Anoop Prasad. I'm a staff attorney in the Immigrant Rights Program at the Asian Law Caucus. The Asian Law Caucus is a civil rights organization in San Francisco. We've been around since 1972. My work is largely representing immigrants that are facing deportation. And my client base is largely Southeast Asian refugees, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong, Lao, Mien refugees who came here in the 70s and 80s and are now facing deportation, largely for criminal convictions. And the experience is really common across a lot of these refugee communities of resettlement in the US, where the resettlement process was really flawed. They were resettled in neighborhoods that had really high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, high rates of incarceration at the height of the war on drugs, and a lot of them were funneled into the prison system, the criminal system when they were teenagers, and now decades later are facing deportation. And it's become a particular issue and problem as the Trump administration has cracked down, especially on Vietnamese and Cambodian communities with deportation raids. And it's one of those issues which gets overlooked a lot in a lot of the narratives around the Asian experience.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Russell Jeung. I'm chair of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary of the Third World Strike and the founding of Asian American Studies. I've been living for the last 3 decades in a low-income Asian American community in Oakland. And there, I think, I see a lot of pressing issues facing low-income and working-class Asian Americans. And if you talk about, you're not supposed to talk about like an oppression Olympics, but I do think that people living on the margins, living on the edge, do face a lot more struggle and suffering. And so I have a lot of unhoused neighbors who are Asian American. I actually have students at San Francisco State who are in Asian American studies, majoring in Asian American studies, living in their cars. And so issues of class and the intersectionality with race and immigration and gender, I think are really pressing for our time that a lot of the Asian American community isn't aware of. Besides homelessness, on a broader scale, we're having mass displacement of Asian American communities. You can see Chinatowns being disappearing. You see a lot of gentrification in low-income Asian American communities. So I find that really significant.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mindy Chang, and I'm the former executive director, now board member of Collaboration. And Collaboration is a nonprofit organization and a grassroots movement to unify, discover, connect, elevate Asian American Pacific Islander artists. So we deal with artists, musicians, dancers, comedians, filmmakers, actors. I'm also an actor, now writer, podcast host, MC, etc. Multi-hyphenate millennial, that is my representation on this panel. And the most pressing issue that I'm interested in is definitely diversity in Hollywood. That is my entire universe, especially Asian American representation. Working and within and understanding the industry itself, but also the implications that it has and the ripple effects of representation in media in everything everyone on this panel is talking about, on immigration, on politics, on the economy, in leadership roles in companies like Google, the bamboo ceiling, everything. There's such a wide diaspora of Asian Americans, most of which, 99% of which never gets represented and is just beginning to have a voice in mainstream media, and what the dynamics of that are. And now I'm working on writing films and shows so that I can contribute and continue to talk in spaces like this to help make those connections. So for me, it's understanding working in Hollywood, also connecting that to other industries and other communities, because this is much larger of an issue and a much larger strategy is necessary.
Right, so how does diversity, or if you want to use intersectionality, diaspora, whatever your word is, show up in your everyday life? And how does this impact your work?
Well, I was going to say, I think every Asian American, actually every individual here, will experience diversity in their families. So I'm actually fifth, sixth generation American. And my family has gone through, exclusion, segregation, a lot of the racial barriers that a lot of people of color face. But even within my own immediate family, I'm Chinese, married to a Korean. We have 2 foster daughters who are refugees from Burma. And then my extended family are pretty multiracial. And so I think everybody, even if your family was of the same ethnicity, you have generational divides, you'll have gender divides. So and then when we go out to eat, you're not always eating Chinese food and rice every day. So I think we all experience diversity in our relationships and in our histories and in just our day-to-day interactions with people at our workplace or at our school. So diversity is totally relevant in our circumstances in the U.S.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Did you want me to talk about that now, or do you want me, is there another question?
I know Minji's dying to talk about
Well, I
Crazy Rich Asians.
I'm curious. Well, one of my examples of how I deal with diversity on my day-to-day life is that there's a film coming out in August 17th, FYI, called Crazy Rich Asians, and John Chu, who's from the Bay, as am I, he's directing it. It's an ensemble Asian American. It's Asian. It's actually a global Asian cast. Half of whom are Asian American, and the recognizing as a data point, if you will, the fact that it's been Joy Luck Club, which was 25 years ago, was the last mainstream studio-backed ensemble modern day Asian American family that was on screen, is a big freaking deal. That it's been 25 years, and the fact that there's the show Fresh Off the Boat and Dr. Ken, that there are these blips on the radar about diverse representation of Asian Americans, that they're so heavily weighted in terms of the gravity of this is representing all Asians, when it's not. I mean, everyone here knows that there are more than 46 ethnicities and cultures and way more languages. But the Asian includes so many different people, and yet people are writing these individual shows or these handful of actors to be the end-all be-all representatives of diversity. That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of excitement because diversity suddenly matters right now. So for me, the way I'm experiencing it is I'm choosing to look at the positive. I'm choosing to look at these are opportunities and gateways that if this movie does well, and it does matter that this movie does well, as controversial as some people might be about this is just Chinese people and this is just about Chinese in Singapore. Did you read the book? Like, that's what the book's about. And you cannot in one singular movie define and represent all of Asian America. But still, if this film does well, it does open up doors for so many other projects to get greenlit. And Asians do have a representation in Hollywood. And whether this is true or not, I don't know if this is an actual fact, people will say, like, Asians don't support each other. They don't watch each other's shows. If we make a show or a film about Asian people, the numbers, like the audience doesn't reflect that, right? So on a numbers and business and industry basis, diversity is in my wheelhouse in my life every single day in terms of not just authentic storytelling, but the business of the data points, who are the butts in the seats, how are we showing up, what kind of viewership are we giving, and what does that do, right, for everybody moving forward in terms of getting other projects, other stories told.
Yeah, well, let's test that right now. How many of you know Crazy Rich Asians is going to come out? Maybe. Okay. Okay, here's a real test. How many of you actually have it in your phone the date and you're like already organizing your friends? Anybody? Okay,
A viewing party.
Okay, right.
Dressing up.
But the point is, right, like representation matters, right? I think that's what you're saying. Yes. Anything to add?
Well, I think what's interesting is I think the community support is also really essential when you're talking about if an Asian American movie comes out, and I do understand the instinct to critique and to be concerned because there has been so little representation in the past that anything that comes out, we're so fearful of misrepresentation and more misassumptions and biases. But that support and that dialogue is incredibly important for it to be fostered and to filter out through the community. I think the same applies to the literature. I think the same applies to visual art and to other forms of communication and bringing people together through art to be able to articulate our experiences. And so that diversity becomes pretty crucial. And I agree, diversity happens, like the reason why I started writing was I looked around the dinner table at my family and realized that each of my aunt and uncles and cousins and my mom and my dad and my grandparents all had a very unique migration story from Vietnam to America. All of them. They had very different experiences, and that's within a family, right? And so there has to be a recognition and appreciation, I think, of that diversity and being able to listen to each other and foster that communication.
And yet there still is this tension, right? This desire to recognize specific and individual experiences with the Asian and Asian American communities, but then also, we're all, this past month, you all been talking about how do we come together? How do we, move forward together, right? So what are some examples in which you've seen, and I'm thinking of you, Anoop, in particular, right? You've seen people negotiate that tension and find a way to build coalitions and come together.
So storytelling is something that's really important for us at the Asian Law Caucus and telling our client stories. And we're always, we talk to thousands and thousands of people every month, right? And the question always is like, which stories do we tell, right? And so for us, part of that is determining who in our communities with all this diversity has privilege, right? Who has the spotlight, who has the microphone, and who doesn't, right? So we try to use the privilege that we have, right? The spotlight that we have to tell stories that aren't being told. And so, the stories that do get told, not just in Hollywood, but also over social media or sort of in our communities of, who's in our community leaves out a lot of people. I often jokingly refer to myself as Asian asterisk, right? Because South Asians are often left out of the narrative of who's considered Asian, right? Pacific Islanders, we say API, but really no one really thinks about or talks about Pacific Islanders most of the time. The experience of a lot of Southeast Asian refugees is also left out, and you get this very sort of East Asian-centric narrative about who's Asian. And so to some degree, I think we should think about those things when we're thinking about whose stories are we telling. The stories of South Asians in culture, it's the Quickie Mart owner, the cab driver, and the terrorist. Like those are the three representations we have. There's this Muslim ban happening, but it's not really considered an Asian issue. So I think in some degree, when we talk about building these coalitions, it's also important to recognize who in our really diverse community has privilege, and to what degree can they center these other stories that are being left out and help tell those stories instead of occupying the spotlight with their own stories.
So Russell, when you're teaching Asian American studies, you're talking to students about this tension as well. What are some of the stories that resonate with them about the ways Asians and Asian Americans have come together as a coalition to be able to do things like address injustice, or address maybe not even bad things, but just come together in coalition? What are the stories that resonate with students?
Well, Amy was just involved in one. One of our classes on Vietnamese American literature did a poetry reading around the Me Too movement. And we found that over half our class could relate to the issue of domestic violence and abuse on a personal, 1 degree of separation level. So there's a lot of concrete issues around which we could build solidarity that actually totally resonate. And then we could divide up that issue as being a racialized issue, as a gendered issue. And when people are able to not only see their own families affected, but also develop that empathy to build solidarity with others, I think that's how my students move. Hearing each other's stories, both knowing the individual uniqueness of that story, but making those connections with others, and seeing how race, how transnationalism, how capitalism have shaped these experiences to be similar, and how we have a common sort of target of fighting or resisting this oppression. I think that's what mobilizes them.
And Amy, how do you think about the representation, and then also which stories to tell as you're thinking about, the stories that you yourself are writing and what you want to share with the audiences?
Well, my mother was a social worker, and she worked with a lot of children who came over as boat refugees, and she would work on these case files, and it was really important for her to express to her children that to understand the privilege that we came from, the fact that we came over in the first wave, and that we had an education, we had opportunities that other refugees and immigrants did not have. And so she wasn't a creative writer, but she would always be sharing these stories in order, like I said, to increase my compassion and empathy and gratitude as well. Like, you need to be grateful, and what are you going to do with the opportunities that you have, and what stories can you tell? And so I think a very huge reason why I wanted to become a writer was I wasn't reading, at the time, like, there were no Vietnamese American books. There were very few Asian American books. The ones you had are burned in my memories. I still remember Farewell to Manzanar. I remember No No Boy. I remember the very few books on my bookshelf that actually reflected my experience and what I felt like to be someone in a predominantly white environment. And when a child especially recognizes him or herself in a book, it's a validation. It's a self-validation that empowers them, and I think that is something that literature and art can do. And so that's why seeking out those stories, understanding them, like I said, with the Me Too movement, it was part of a collective called She Who Has No Masters. It's a collective of Vietnamese writers, women writers, and gender nonconforming writers, and we wanted to talk about Me Too, and we called it Me Too Vietnamese Bodies. What are the stories that aren't being told, right? Because Me Too, the Me Too movement is rooted in social media and not. There are many people who are not on social media. How do we collect those stories? How do we eliminate a lot of that shame? And it's about listening. It's about listening and then conveying these stories and talking with each other.
I mean, I know for me, coming to understand and appreciate my own identity as a Chinese American in relation to my broader, political identity as an Asian American was definitely a process, right? To be able to see myself, and then to be able to see myself as part of a community, right? What was that like for some of you to understand that the sense of self-identity in connection to this broader identity? What is something that you want to share?
I think it happened for me at least late, and I think it might have been just because the time period. Like, I see it happening earlier for my own children. Like, my daughter, who's 9, strongly identifies as a Vietnamese American, as a half Vietnamese American. For me, growing up with a lot of white people around me, I didn't feel proud until college, which is late, but it was incredibly liberating when it happened because that was when I started taking the classes. That's when the Vietnam War wasn't a taboo word. That's when there were classes on issues and histories and literature that were about the people who look like me. And now I feel there are more ethnic studies classes happening earlier in education. There are more cultural opportunities. The Vietnamese community has been here for longer, so we have, and now it's the younger generations teaching the children. And so there are more opportunities when they're younger. But for me, it didn't happen until college.
So I grew up in the Deep South in New Orleans, and I grew up in a Black and Vietnamese neighborhood with very few South Asian people. And so I think I learned early on that I'm not white, but in terms of coming to like an Asian identity, it wasn't exactly clear. I mean, there were way more Vietnamese people than South Asian people in my neighborhood. But I think I definitely learned about race in a much different way than it is in California. I definitely learned about it in terms of this black-white binary that existed and which side of the line I was on. And so I'm still, I think, getting used to being in California and looking around the room like this did not really exist. And same, I work in Oregon, 30-something people, and it's amazing radical Asian lawyers there, but it's still like mind-boggling sometimes, where I am. And it's easy to forget here that Asians are only like 5% of the country.
I grew up in San Francisco, so it was easy growing up in, like, if you're in an ethnic enclave of 90% Asian American, it's pretty easy to develop an Asian American consciousness. And to see the pan-ethnic commonalities, our generational it was really easy because we were all dressing alike, listening to the same type of music, playing the same kind of sports, going to the same clubs. So it became a cultural a subculture that shifted to a political identity as I began to see. I'm privileged in some ways as a middle-class Asian American, but there are other Asian Americans who are suffering a lot more. People in Chinatown who aren't getting their wages that I need to support, given my privilege.
I grew up in Cupertino during the 90s, and if anyone was growing up in South Bay and Bay Area or LA during the 90s, if you guys remember like the Asian Pride era, Asian Pride, special times. That's actually what my first film is about. But that was definitely, the post-riots, all these academic things about the culture that I didn't know until really recently. I just experienced that and like wrote Asian Pride on all my stuff, my screen name, Zanga, AIM, all that stuff. So I was very like immersed in that Asian Pride culture, that subculture. But I didn't realize until I moved to Pleasanton. That was special. Well, it's different now, but at the time when I moved, it was still like 97, 98% white at the time that I moved in the 90s, and it was a very stark realization like of being othered. And it wasn't hostile or negative, but I was definitely singled out, and they assigned me to the other Asian girl you should be friends with Annie. And I was like, oh, okay, and I went with it, I was like, that's my Asian sister. She's my friend. It was an automatic connection. So it was markers like that made me very aware and in a way very prideful about being Korean American, being Asian American. But then navigating that and coming to terms with it really happened again more towards like the end of high school and college, where there are cultural organizations where we're talking more. But even in college, I feel like the conversations were not nearly as sophisticated as now. We did not have the word intersectionality. I ran the Korean American Student Organization. We did community service and we partied. We didn't talk that much about identity. We didn't really dig into what those dynamics were. We would put on culture shows as a celebration, but we wouldn't really go in depth. So I feel like it's been a very ongoing process, and then joining Collaboration and starting the Bay Area chapter in 2009 was definitely an eye-opening experience to the wider diversity of Asian America. And I'm continually, I feel like now I'm going through Asian American studies. I wasn't interested in taking those courses when I went to Cal, and they're available for me, I just wasn't interested, which is bizarre.
That's okay. We won't tell your teachers.
Yeah, please don't.
So, Minji started touching on, I think, how things have changed for you over time, right? So, I want to reflect a little bit on that and think about what is our future? What does our community's future look like? And in terms of the diversity, the identities, and our ability to, what are we working on in terms of coming together? So, what do you all think is in our future for Asians and Asian Americans? Why don't we start with collaboration? Because you probably you've seen so much, and to a certain extent, the work that you've done in collaboration is also very future facing, right?
Absolutely. I've been educated more through the people I've met through collaboration because it was across North America, including Canada, and like understanding how different my upbringing in the Bay Area, my privileged and very diverse upbringing in the Bay is very different than Detroit, Michigan, different than Atlanta, Georgia, different than Washington, D.C. And so that has been alone just its own education. But what I see in like my peers, in the people who support us and the younger generation, because of social media, because of YouTube, like changed the game. There's more conversation happening at a much more rapid pace that's more sophisticated, more nuanced, and therefore I think more just motivational for young kids to learn who they are, love who they are, and just go out and make amazing things. They don't have the same level of self-consciousness or the same self-limitations that we've all had to navigate for different reasons, whether we're like our geographical location or the way our parents raised us. I inherited my 1980 version of Korea from my parents. You know what I mean? I didn't grow up with the current Korea. I go there and I feel like very much othered there as much as I'm Korean American, right? So we have these very unique stories, and the coalitions are real. The South Asian community, everybody, I honestly think this political climate is as awful as it is a blessing in disguise to get people to care and to move. So they're saying, okay, fine, we're gonna, with this like collectively marginalized community, what do we have to do? And that's creating a lot of urgency to put aside whatever, competitive agendas and all that. And it's like, there is a lot more unity, a lot more strategy, I feel like, because now there's this shared goal of, if we don't speak up for ourselves, if we don't make it a priority to fund, get films greenlit, to make sure to create programs, like all the major studios have diversity programs now. This did not exist. So this creates opportunities for me as an actor that I didn't have, that it was a different playing field 5-10 years ago. And now they're creating diversity programs where they're seeking out women of color, LGBTQ, women, everyone of color, LGBTQ, millennials. They're trying to get different voices in there on purpose because people are getting pissed off enough and inspired enough to say, we want to see our communities on screen. You can't whitewash us out of our own stories and think we're gonna like sit peacefully by and watch this nonsense, you know what I mean? So I credit social media. That's why I'm so proud to be from the Bay and to have had my roots in Silicon Valley, because things that are happening in this place are changing the entire world.
Yeah, that's true.
So I look to that, and that is the future in technology and all the platforms that are emerging. You are not relegated to like 5 studios running all of media. You know what I mean? You have a lot more voices, and people are getting scared, which is good. Keep them on their toes.
Would it jump in, Russell?
Yeah, can I bounce off that? So we have more platforms, we have more opportunities to create voice. I think emerging Asian Americans will become the creative class of America. If you look in academia today, if you look even in the world of literature and arts, there's a lot of Asian Americans going into it because of selective immigration. Those coming in today are educated professionals, and their kids are becoming the creative class. And so the creative class are those who create culture, who create the discourses by which we sort of understand the world. The danger, though, of Asian Americans becoming the creative class, and as I see this, sorry to dump on millennials, is that
Please, go ahead.
we've all become digital prisoners.
It's okay, there's Q&A after that.
Everyone's sort of trapped on their own phones, and we become hyper-individualized. And so that makes mobilizing on a collective scale a lot more difficult. It's easier to do social movements through social media, but it also divides and conquers us to be market rather than communities. Yeah. And so as we become the creative class, I think we could redefine what it means to be Asian American. Nobody thinks of Asian Americans with a history of justice necessarily, or an ethic of compassion. But as we develop into this creative class, as long as we could build those commonalities and solidarities and that empathy, and start working not just on behalf of our own self-interest, but out of the concerns for low-income people or for other marginalized groups, then we can actually have possibilities to create our identity that we want it to be. Asian Americans being a just people, Asian Americans being a people of equity. So for me, that's the hope, that the term and the grouping of Asian American has all this unforeseen possibility. And people here are the people who are sort of filling in the gaps of what it means to be Asian American. And so it's both exciting, but we're also a little bit too imprisoned by our phones.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anoop.
Yeah. So I think we're at a place of crisis and a turning point right now about whether or not we take that plunge towards being a community about justice. So we're the fastest growing community of color in the country, even though we're still only I think 5.5%. And I think the country's in the state of crisis right now, right? And there's a war happening over white supremacy, which has been happening in this country for centuries, right? But right now it's out in the open. And so I think the Asian community is at this place where it needs to pick its sides. And for a really long time, and by intention, we've been used as a weapon against black people and against people of color, right? Our immigration system is set up so that it's only educated Asians that are allowed to easily come to the US, right? And so we were always held up by white supremacy as the good immigrants, right? We come here legally. We're not like Latino immigrants that cross the border. We're held up against black people as, they're people of color, but they have really high graduation rates and their incarceration rates aren't high. Why can't black people be like Asians, right? And that started almost immediately after the Civil Rights Movement, was that we were pitted against other communities of color. And to a large degree, a lot of our communities at times have played into that. Sometimes that was survival, of we're going to try and be respectable and be the good immigrants, and it'll get us as close to whiteness as we can, right? There's this hierarchy where we're never quite going to have the rights of white people, but maybe it'll get us close. And I think there was this decision by some communities at certain times to go along with that because they needed to survive as immigrants in this country. But in the end, it's becoming clearer and clearer that that isn't going to protect us, right? The Muslim ban doesn't care if you're respectable or not. It doesn't care if you have a PhD. It doesn't matter, right? So I think we're at this juncture of we need to decide about whether we're going to be silent about white supremacy, quietly sort of play into respectability, or cast our lot with other communities of color. And I think there's a narrow window that we now have as a community in making these decisions.
Yeah, Amy?
I'm very aware that any success I have is due to community organizations. The organizations I credited to become a writer are the Asian American Journal Association, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, and Asian American Studies departments around the country that help support my writing and help support my book. And so it was always built into me that if it wasn't for these people who had been successful and were looking to cultivate the younger generations, I wouldn't have what I had. And so I think that made me much more appreciative of how important community organizations are in terms of influencing generations and allyship. And that certainly applies to this current political climate. And I realize that sometimes social media can feel like a bubble, like you're only talking to the people who are like you. But I do see, since the election, more political activism. And how are we going to use the resources we have? Like what superpowers do we have to fight against the things that we're really concerned about? And so I see, graphic novelists drawing and depicting cases of undocumented immigrants, right? I see more writing, I see more editorials, I see more art. And these are fostering conversations and helping create dialogue so that that threat of, especially for Asian American communities, to look inward and only protect themselves can't necessarily happen anymore. And I think constantly reminding and being reminded of the fact that this happened to us just 40 years ago, right? Just a little over 40 years ago, where everything was taken away. It can happen to any of us. So what are we going to do? How are we going to help each other? And I think reminding ourselves about that allyship and community space is important.
Thank you so much. I think between calling us into this discussion about where are we going to stand, what are we going to do, and how are we going to come together. I think each of you in your own way, talked about that. So, all right, so it's your turn now. We've heard such rich conversation up here. I want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask questions, to engage with the panelists as well. If you have a question, please step up. There's a mic right here, right in front of me. Please do that so that we can get you on and we can hear you. Come on up.
Oh, baby.
I didn't preset any questions, so I don't have any plants in the audience. So yeah, okay, we have a question right here. Come on up.
So, my name is Grace Yu. Professor Jeung had some thoughts. He thought the phone was making our generation hyper individualized, and that we needed to move forward. And that Asian Americans hopefully would be sort of this just community. So granted that phones aren't going to go away, I had a question for you, Professor Jeung. How can we use the phone? Amy, you suggested that the phone, in some sense, has sort of galvanized and organized folks. So I guess the question maybe for everybody is, how can we use technology? It's not going to go away anytime soon, and people will have their phones. How can we use technology in a way that brings together community and moves our community along towards justice?
Great question. Who wants to jump in?
So in my work, we actually use social media quite a bit to organize, and it's not by itself. There's also organizing happening on the ground in communities, but social media is really critical for a lot of the advocacy we do. I remember, Muslim Ban 1.0, that first weekend, right? Where it got signed Friday night, and we started working that very night, and then I was blown away by the number of people that we were able to mobilize, and would not have been able to do that without the internet, right? Our standard way of mobilizing for an action is flyers and word of mouth, and that would not have turned out, thousands of people at every airport in the country within a few hours, right? Often we run anti-deportation campaigns, and you were mentioning artists are really stepping up and helping tell stories through artwork. Dibui, who's a really amazing graphic novelist, has been helping us with a lot of our anti-deportation campaigns and making artwork for online petitions, which have an enormous amount of impact in getting people free from detention and also telling their stories. We use it to pass legislation. We do call-in actions, all using social media, using Facebook and Twitter. Sorry to plug Google's competitors, but it is really a critical part of our work now.
What are you seeing, Minji, in terms of the innovative ways performing artists are using technology?
I think it's been happening organically, and with being in a generation that has grown up in a lot of our formative years, and then with a new generation where they just are born out the womb knowing how to hashtag. People get savvier by the day, and I think YouTube itself, for Asian America, period, everyone credits YouTube for changing Asian America, because the YouTubers, there's a specific generation, specifically between 2006 and 2012, the content creators, because we were not inundated with content at that point, and they're still early adopters, right? The celebrities that emerged out of that YouTube generation still make a living off of that today. It created a gateway for Asian Americans to influence a whole other generation of younger Asian Americans to see themselves, because there's a lot of kids out there who will look at YouTube as a bigger deal than network television. They can identify their YouTube stars. They cannot identify, Jimmy Fallon or whoever, right? And so it's just really interesting because that gave people confidence, and it makes that ripple effect. I really believe in the power of art, like a book, a song, or a skit. It's so random, but it really gives a kid or an older, whoever watches it, they're like, oh, they get me. They get my story. Oh, and then they start messaging each other. They share it, like the sharing of videos and there's tweeting and all that. It has massive ripple effects. You don't know what kinds of seeds that plants, right? And So I think the internet's incredibly powerful. It can galvanize people. It motivates people. It pisses people off because they're like, oh, you made that skit, but that was funny, but it was at the expense of these people, right? I've seen these conversations happen where like young Asian American kids would kind of make a gay joke. And then that would cause a whole conversation about the issues within the Asian American community about not acknowledging the LGBTQ community, right? And so then someone will go out and make their own skit to like, that's kind of the age that we live in. There's tons of content out there, but I think that that's what needs to happen. It's not just theory and our thoughts. We've got to do, we got to say, and we got to speak, and that's what's going to keep maturing the conversation. That's what's going to make content creators get better at what they do. Like I can sit here and say, I'm a writer, but if I never put words on a piece of paper, type it out, I'll never get better. And I think that's a lot of the things that I've seen in Asian America is like that self-limitation, this fear of rocking the boat, this fear of like shaming our families. I can't air my family's dirty laundry because all our stories are so personal and very deep. But if we don't do that, then we're just gonna stay invisible. You know what I mean? So that like if you're a generation of kids and you can actually say, I don't like the Scarlett Johansson casting, that's great. Like the world needs to know that. And then Hollywood Reporter can write an editorial on that about the problematic nature of whitewashing. And they'll bring up Mickey Rooney. They'll bring up everything, Bruce Lee, include everything. And then we can start having those conversations. So sharing, I believe in every individual in here, just because you're not an actor or a writer or a CEO or producer or whatever, everyone through their power of their phone has the power of influence. Those data, somebody's looking at that data. Somebody's making decisions based off of that, right? Like viewership. There are artists that are independent that make their living off of YouTube viewership and get hired to speak at colleges or like do a little music tour. They make their living off of that. So those views, I know for a fact, count so much. So I like, don't ever like take yourself out of the running of your own influence.
Russell, Amy, some quick last thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. Technology isn't necessarily organic, and the development, it's capitalized and it's funded, and people are making money off of technology. And I would argue that technology has become the opiate of the masses. That Asian Americans are so concerned about their representation and how they are seen and whether we're invisible. Who's invisible to who? I see my family every day. I see them. I know them. I know them by name.
Yeah.
They're not invisible to me. I know their story. They don't have to tell me their story. They're not voiceless. So, but we're so concerned about representation, but we're not concerned about real people living in real conditions. And so it's both and.
It is, yeah.
That our representations need to affect how we care about people and their material conditions. Are they poor? Do they have health care access? Can they speak to a doctor in their language? So I'm sort of concerned that for Asian Americans who are so concerned about representation, they got to get outside of technology and start dealing with real people and real situations and develop a sense of compassion and heart. So it's not just about telling a story, it's about alleviating the injustices and the poverty and the struggles that a lot of people are going through. And a lot of Asian Americans who look like you and me, if you're Asian American, who could be like your grandparents, are going through really hard difficulties. And if all we care about is representation, I think it's just like, oh, I'm going to just watch another YouTube video to de-stress, right? Social media is causing Asian Americans to have higher rates of anxiety and depression now in this generation than ever before. So it has its good things, but we have to be aware.
But that's also residual from actual Asia. I mean, Koreans have the highest rate of suicide in the world, and alcoholism and plastic surgery. And like, that's a documentary I would like to make to talk about. They don't want to talk about it though. So like, I completely, I'm learning so much. I really want to talk to you. This is great though, but because I feel like there's just this difference because the people that I'm around, the artists that I'm around in particular, they care about everything about that. So there's always going to be pockets and a range of people who care. I'm just like a beauty vlogger, just send me all the sponsored products and that's all they care about, fine. But they have influence on like when they start talking about body image and anxiety and like dysmorphia, anorexia, like eating disorders, whatever. And then you can have the people who are very social justice minded because when they see that only the things that people are talking about are things about looking pretty in your Instagram filter, it's gonna cause a rise out of people who are like, what about refugees? What about poverty? And they'll get motivated to make those stories shine too.
I mean, there's tensions, right? Amy, you have the last word.
Well, I think it's the content and the social media that is making us anxious. Like, there is a lot of noise, but I think people can also become really good about listening to what's important. A lot of those stories, we wouldn't know about them if they weren't on social media. And I do think the reason why representation is important, it becomes a gateway. Like, those stories are important for us to feel. Most people feel they are motivated by their emotions rather than by facts. Like, I didn't really understand, or I didn't really feel the impact of so many historical events until I read about it, about even fictional characters experiencing that emotion, going through these feelings of shame or anger or frustration or alienation. And that is how we create compassion with other people, and that's how other people learn our stories, and then they try to make a difference. But if we don't have those stories available, then we're not going to have people curious to be able to hear more and listen and pay attention to the very real issues of the fact that there is an incredible diversity in Asian Americans, and that we have the opportunities to help each other, to help all income levels of Asian Americans, and see where we're coming from and where we're supposed to go.
Well, I want to thank each of you, Aimee, Anoop, Russell, Minji, for contributing to a really, really rich conversation. Can we say thank you to them?